In the blazing world of heavy metal, where guitars scream and vocals tear through the air, few would expect a quiet bass player to become the true soul of a band. Cliff Burton, the young man with wild red hair, piercing eyes, and a bass guitar that felt like a doorway to another world, entered history not through scandal or noise, but through notes that were as fierce as they were haunting, like the toll of a death bell. At just 24, Cliff was taken suddenly in a bus accident in Sweden, leaving Metallica at the peak of their rise with a void that could never be filled. Yet it was precisely this brevity that made him a legend. 3 years, 3 albums, and a legacy that forever changed the way the world viewed the role of bass in rock. Cliff was never one for the spotlight. He was the guy who wore the same flared jeans, spent hours reading Tolkien or philosophy, and then stepped on stage to turn the bass into a weapon, both destructive and mesmerizing. In an era when many rockers drowned in booze, drugs, and scandal, Cliff Burton chose a different life, honest, straightforward, and wholly devoted to music. His story is not only a tragedy of a life cut too short, but also proof that sometimes silence can be the most eternal sound in rock. Clifford Lee Burton was born on February 10, 1962 in Castro Valley, California, a quiet little town nestled among green hills where mornings were draped in thin mist and the air felt untouched by the chaos of the big cities. The Burton family belonged to the middle class, living simply and without pretense. Cliff was the youngest of 3 siblings, raised in a household where music and books were as natural as breathing. That home was never filled with arguments, nor driven by material ambition. Instead, it resonated with the gentle sound of the piano drifting from the living room, where the children would sit for hours, listening and letting their imaginations wander. Cliff's parents, Ray and Jan Burton, encouraged their children to dream freely, to seek joy in art and knowledge. It was within this calm and nurturing atmosphere that the first seeds of Cliff's profound, different soul were planted, setting him apart from many of his peers. Among his siblings, Cliff was closest to his brother Scott and sister Connie. To Cliff, Scott was not only an older brother but also a hero, a role model, someone to look up to. Yet the family's peaceful life was torn apart by an unexpected tragedy. When Cliff was just 13, Scott suddenly died from a brain aneurysm at the age of 16. That brother, his confidant, his anchor, his most important companion, was gone too soon, leaving Cliff with a wound no one could ever heal. But the pain did not erupt into rebellion or aimless anger, as it often does for other teenagers. Cliff chose silence, and he chose one thing to cling to: the bass guitar. He played for hours on end, each note a way of calling his brother's name. His fingertips bled, but he never stopped. For Cliff, every string was a lifeline tying his soul to Scott. In those long, lonely nights, he whispered a vow no one else could hear: "I will become the best bass player to honor him." From that moment on, music was no longer a hobby or a fleeting diversion. It became a home, a sanctuary for grief and memory, the only way to keep Scott's presence alive. In that small room in Castro Valley, a 13-year-old boy began a musical journey. Not to be famous, not to impress, but to turn loss into strength, to transform silence into a voice. Beyond music, Cliff also sought refuge in literature and philosophy. He read H.P. Lovecraft to immerse himself in dark, mysterious worlds, devoured Tolkien to lose himself in enchanted realms, and listened to Bach or Beethoven before switching to Black Sabbath, never seeing them as opposites. To Cliff, light and darkness always coexisted. Beauty and gloom did not cancel each other out, but complemented one another. This very worldview would later become the essence of his bass sound: ferocious yet lyrical, shadowed yet hauntingly beautiful. At school, his friends called him an old soul, the kid who always carried a book, smiling gently but distantly, as if his mind was wandering somewhere far beyond. Yet for those who grew close enough, Cliff revealed himself as a soul of depth, tenderness, and genuine kindness. He wasn't quick to open up, but once he did, his trust and sincerity were absolute. To his family and those who loved him, Cliff embodied one undeniable truth. There are flames that do not burn fiercely, yet they never go out. That flame was music. The very force that not only kept Cliff standing through loss, but would one day make the entire rock world bow its head in awe. As Cliff Burton moved through his teenage years, he was no longer just the boy sitting alone in his room, turning grief into sound. The bass became his very breath, and each day revolved around practice, finding ways to transform an instrument often dismissed as background into the central voice. After the devastating loss of Scott, Cliff's parents did not try to hold him back. Instead, they quietly supported their youngest son's pursuit of music. For them, the most important thing was that Cliff had found comfort and purpose. He began with a few small bands around the Bay Area, including Easy Street, where he played alongside Jim Martin, who would later become the guitarist for Faith No More. Even in garage rehearsals or tiny pub gigs, Cliff's bass playing was already drawing attention. Not loud, not showy, but haunting. That's how many described the sound he brought to the stage. It wasn't until he joined Trauma, a young metal band, that Cliff truly stepped into the spotlight. On stage, with his wild mane of hair, flared 70s jeans, and a bass roaring through distortion and wah-wah like thunder, Cliff didn't need to speak or pose. Each solo was enough to hypnotize the crowd. People didn't just hear the music, they felt the presence of a soul screaming and whispering at once. In 1982, during a Trauma show in Los Angeles, two young musicians from Metallica, James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich, were in the audience. They had grown weary of searching for a new bassist to replace Ron McGovney. But when Cliff took the stage, just a few minutes of his bass solo, distorted like a guitar, dramatic yet anchored in rhythm, convinced them instantly. It wasn't only his technique, but the raw, undefinable energy radiating from him, both rough and sacred. Metallica quickly approached Cliff, but the red-haired musician was not easily swayed by the lure of the spotlight. When James and Lars invited him to join, he gave them a condition that seemed almost unreasonable. "I'll join if you move the band up to the Bay Area." That was his home, the place of family, friends, and the music scene he felt connected to. To him, Los Angeles was a land of artifice, asphalt, and temptations. The Bay Area was where music still carried a soul. The condition gave Metallica pause, but in the end, they agreed. That decision would change the fate not only of the band, but of heavy metal itself. Cliff officially joined Metallica at the end of 1982. From that moment, the young, wild, and unruly band gained a new depth. James later admitted that Cliff was like the band's moral compass. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words often made everyone stop and reconsider. Musically, Cliff was more than a bassist. He brought philosophical thought, the heart of a poet, and a rare subtlety into the world of metal. In those early Bay Area days, Metallica rehearsed relentlessly. Cliff would sit quietly in a corner, scribbling down ideas, then offering suggestions that left both James and Lars nodding in agreement. His silent presence began shaping Metallica into something greater. Not just a raw thrash metal act, but a musical force destined to transcend expectations. Cliff never sought the spotlight, yet paradoxically, his quietness made him the center of attention. He didn't play bass as a duty, but as a storyteller. And from that point on, his story began to leave the small room in Castro Valley to echo across the world. In 1983, Metallica released their debut album Kill 'Em All, a furious manifesto for the thrash metal generation. Yet in the midst of raging riffs, relentless drumming, and James Hetfield's fiery vocals, Cliff Burton stunned the world with a moment unlike anything in metal's history. The solo piece, Anesthesia, Pulling Teeth. This was not filler, not a throwaway track to pad an album. It was a philosophical explosion. Cliff transformed the bass, long dismissed as background, into the central voice, even the narrator. Using wah-wah, distortion, and tapping, techniques few had ever dared apply to bass, he dragged the instrument out of the shadows and gave it a soul of its own. Listeners realized for the first time that bass could scream, weep, and tell stories with as much force as any guitar. Anesthesia was not just a display of technique. It was Cliff's musical manifesto, his declaration, "I am here, and I will make the bass speak." If Kill 'Em All was the raw blast of youth, then Ride the Lightning, 1984, revealed Metallica, thanks to Cliff, stepping into a deeper, more layered, more philosophical realm. Cliff did more than contribute musical ideas. He helped shape the very structure, themes, and emotions of the album. The clearest proof is For Whom the Bell Tolls. From the very intro, Cliff's bass, so distorted many mistook it for guitar, rang out like a funeral bell. Slow, heavy, evoking war, death, the futility of violence. It wasn't a mere intro riff. It was an oral painting, a tolling bell that dragged the entire album into darker depths. Cliff's imprint was also carved into The Call of Cthulhu, a sprawling instrumental inspired by H.P. Lovecraft. Here, his love for literature and philosophy translated directly into music, a wordless piece that conjured an entire universe of the void, eerie and cold. Ride the Lightning became a turning point. Metallica was no longer just a savage thrash act, but a band with an artistic soul. And it was Cliff Burton, through his silence, his philosophy, his haunting bass lines, who lit that fire. In 1986, Metallica entered the studio to create their third album, Master of Puppets. If Kill 'Em All was the storm's beginning and Ride the Lightning opened the philosophical dimension, Master of Puppets was the summit, the masterpiece where everything converged. At its very core, Cliff Burton's mark was undeniable. On this record, Cliff didn't simply play bass, he turned it into an instrument of storytelling. Blending distortion, wah-wah, tapping, and his lifelong love of Bach and Beethoven, he wove soundscapes both ferocious and delicate, destructive yet poetic. The music was no longer just aggressive riffs. It became an inner dialogue, a spiritual experience. The culmination of this vision was Orion. With no lyrics, only sound, it was Cliff's testament. From the opening notes reverberating like the hum of the cosmos, to the middle section where the bass led like a lost soul searching for its path, Orion was Cliff's confession in music, deep, haunting, and heartbreakingly beautiful. James Hetfield once said, "If you want to know who Cliff was, listen to Orion." And indeed, within those 8 minutes, one could feel everything: grief, pride, solitude, and the longing of an artist who never fully belonged to this world. Even as Metallica drew closer to commercial success, touring with Ozzy Osbourne, praised by the press, mobbed by fans across Europe, Cliff remained unchanged. He cared little for fame or fortune. Backstage, he read books. On the tour bus, he wrote letters by hand to his girlfriend. In spare moments, he wandered alone, watching nature. He seemed to accept fame only as the price he had to pay to play music the way his heart demanded. And that is what made Cliff Burton irreplaceable, not only to Metallica, but to an entire generation. He was the one who dragged metal out of simple rebellion and into depth, philosophy, and the realm of music as a spiritual journey. While others screamed to be heard, Cliff simply played and made the world listen in a way it never had before. He appeared on only 3 albums. But with those 3, Cliff Burton rewrote the role of the bass in rock. And when he left this world, the entire metal community trembled. Not only because a band lost a member, but because music lost a soul who knew how to turn silence into the most haunting beauty. Unlike the stereotypical image of an 80s rocker, where hard liquor, drugs, and all-night parties were considered the norm, Cliff Burton chose his own path. He despised showiness, kept away from wild parties, and often avoided noisy places after shows. While his peers drowned themselves in smoke and drink, Cliff would sit quietly in a corner, opening a book of philosophy or classical literature. In his free time, he preferred solitary walks, observing nature, letting his mind drift between reflection and music. Cliff's personal style also reflected his loyalty to his true self. Even as Metallica grew famous and his bandmates began experimenting with leather outfits, spiked hair, and flashy accessories to appeal to fans, Cliff stuck to his look. Flared 70s jeans, a faded flannel shirt, worn-out Converse sneakers, and a mane of tangled hair. He didn't care whether he was in fashion. The only thing that mattered to him was staying true to himself. In the seductive world of music, Cliff's love for Corinne Lynn became his rare source of emotional grounding. They met in the Bay Area when Cliff was already gaining recognition with Metallica, but unlike many women drawn to the glamour, Corinne was captivated by his simplicity and sincerity. Their love was quiet, unpretentious, yet deep, just like Cliff himself. He wasn't romantic in the conventional sense of roses or sweet words, but he cared in subtle, genuine ways, writing her letters by hand while on tour, buying small but meaningful gifts, or simply sitting in silence, listening when she needed a shoulder to lean on. Though they never married, Cliff and Corinne lived as if they were husband and wife, sharing joy, sorrow, and even plans for the future. Close friends recalled that Cliff had thought about having children, but he wanted to be certain he was mature enough to give a family a true and steady life. He was determined not to repeat the mistakes of other musicians who let their children grow up in emptiness. That love, sadly, lasted only a few years before fate cut it short. When Cliff died in the 1986 accident, Corinne Lynn was devastated. Those close to her said she never truly recovered from the loss. For years afterward, she chose to live quietly, avoiding the media, keeping Cliff's memory as an irreplaceable part of her life. The Burton family remained in touch with her, treating her as one of their own, a living bond to Cliff that no one else could replace. To his friends and colleagues, Cliff was respected not only for his talent, but also for his absolute honesty and integrity. James Hetfield once called him Metallica's moral compass, the only one willing to say what no one else wanted to hear if it clashed with his values. Cliff never compromised with pretense. His music, his life, and his love for Corinne all carried the same spirit, honesty to the very end. In 1986, Metallica stood at the very peak of their ascent. Master of Puppets had just been released, hailed as a masterpiece not only in the band's career, but in the entire history of heavy metal. Their European tour, Damage Inc., drew tens of thousands of fervent fans, and on every stage, Cliff Burton illuminated the air with music that was both ferocious and poetic. On the night of September 26th in Stockholm, Sweden, Metallica delivered one of the most electrifying performances of the tour. The audience was still reeling from Master of Puppets when Cliff suddenly stepped forward, pulled at his bass, and launched into the Star-Spangled Banner in a way no one could have imagined, warped, thunderous, both sacred and rebellious. His bass thundered through the venue, echoing across the rows of seats until the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. It was the last solo Cliff would ever gift to the world. After the show, the band boarded their bus to travel overnight to Copenhagen. The cramped vehicle forced the members to draw cards for bunks as usual. Kirk Hammett and Cliff were the last two, and Cliff drew the ace of spades, the death card. He then switched bunks with Kirk, saying half joking, half determined, "I want that one." Kirk shrugged. "Fine, take it." No one could have known that such a small choice would decide a fate. At about 6:15 a.m. on September 27th, the bus was driving along a narrow road near Ljungby when it suddenly skidded and swerved violently. In the chaos, Cliff, without a seatbelt, was thrown through a window. Moments later, the bus overturned, crushing him beneath its weight. The band members rushed out, screaming his name, calling frantically for help. A crane was brought to lift the bus, and for a fleeting moment, they held on to hope. But fate was merciless. The chains slipped, and the bus crashed back down, crushing him a second time. Cliff Burton, the soul of Metallica, was gone at only 24 years old. The cause of the crash immediately stirred controversy. The driver claimed the bus had slid on black ice, but James Hetfield walked the road himself and found no trace of ice. He was furious, convinced the driver had fallen asleep. Swedish police ultimately concluded there was insufficient evidence to prosecute, and the case was closed, leaving behind questions with no answers. On October 7, 1986, Cliff's funeral was held in California. His body was cremated, and his ashes scattered near the home where his childhood had once been filled with piano music. During the service, Orion, the instrumental piece Cliff had poured his soul into, was played. It echoed like a wordless farewell, a hauntingly beautiful silence left for the world. Metallica fell into despair. Cliff's death was such a devastating blow that the members even considered breaking up. But after long nights of drinking to forget and crying to remember, they knew that if Cliff were alive, he would never have wanted the band to stop. James Hetfield would later say, "We didn't continue to replace Cliff. We continued to honor him." From that moment on, Metallica's music has carried within it a piece of Cliff Burton's soul. A soul that burned bright, vanished too soon, yet left behind a light that will never fade. Cliff Burton passed away at just 24, but what he left behind did not end with his funeral. For many artists, death means a gradual fading from memory. But for Cliff, the brevity of his life only carved his name deeper, etched permanently into the memories of fans. In the decades since, and even today, his name is remembered not only by Metallica fans, but has transcended to become a cultural symbol within the metal community. He stands as living proof that staying true to music and to oneself can outlast an entire lifetime. No one kept that flame alive more faithfully and warmly than his father, Ray Burton. From the day Cliff died, Ray became his son's quiet ambassador, carrying Cliff's image across the world without ever needing a stage. He regularly appeared at music events, fan gatherings, and Metallica memorials. He never turned down a handshake, never refused to share a story, and always spoke of Cliff with a calm voice, tinged with pride but never boastful. To fans, Ray was not just the father of a legend, but the keeper of Cliff's character, simple, sincere, and enduring, like the bass lines his son left behind. In 2018, Alameda County, where Cliff was born, officially declared February 10th, his birthday, as Cliff Burton Day. It was not a grand celebration with fireworks or stage lights, but a simple day for the metal community worldwide to revisit old songs, share memories and photos, and above all, express gratitude for an artist who lived and gave on his own terms, without compromise, without trade-offs. That same year, Cliff's family partnered with Castro Valley High School, where he once studied, to establish a music scholarship in his name. The scholarship does not demand top grades or extraordinary talent. The only requirement is true passion for music. That was what Cliff lived for, the thing that once drove him to practice until his fingers bled to keep a promise to his late brother Scott, and the spirit he later brought into Metallica as an irreplaceable soul. Beyond official tributes, Cliff Burton's fan community continues to grow globally. Every year, on his birthday and the anniversary of his passing, social media and metal forums overflow with messages, Orion covers, and tearful comments. To them, Cliff is not just a musician, but the artist who was never replaced, even as Metallica soared to immense success with his successors. Metallica themselves have never let his name fade. At major shows, James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich often mention him, offering public tributes. On some nights, Orion is played like a spiritual rite, uniting the band and the crowd in remembrance of the friend and bandmate taken too soon. There is no statue or stone monument built for Cliff, but the music he left behind is his immortal headstone, far stronger than any monument of stone. Cliff's death was not only a personal loss for Metallica, it became a symbolic loss for an entire generation of artists. Those who believed in living authentically, creating without compromise, and leaving a mark without following the crowd. Cliff Burton proved that sometimes a star does not need to live long to live forever. The tributes from family, friends, and fans are only the surface of a much greater legacy. What made Cliff Burton a legend was not just the tragedy of his early death, but the music and spirit he left behind, something that continues to live on with Metallica and the entire world of metal. From Anesthesia, Pulling Teeth, on Kill 'Em All, 1983, he was already defying boundaries. With distortion, wah-wah, tapping, and inspiration from Bach and Beethoven, Cliff proved that bass could scream, whisper, and lead an entire composition. On Ride the Lightning, 1984, his intro bass line in For Whom the Bell Tolls rang out like a funeral bell, while The Call of Cthulhu displayed a symphonic, philosophical vision, where metal reached into darkness yet carried strange beauty. And on Master of Puppets, 1986, Orion became his musical will, a wordless journey where the bass spoke like a soul, lonely yet eternal. But Cliff's legacy is not only in technique. James Hetfield once called him Metallica's moral compass, the one who gave the band not just musical insight, but honesty, principle, and philosophical depth. To Cliff, metal was not just rebellion or brute force. It was a spiritual experience, where philosophy, literature, and classical music blended into new meaning. That influence reached far beyond Metallica. Robert Trujillo, his later successor, has always said he never thought of himself as replacing Cliff, only preserving his legacy. David Ellefson, Megadeth, Steve DiGiorgio, Death Testament, and many other bassists admitted they were shaped by Cliff, both in their playing and in their uncompromising spirit. Metallica themselves never let him be forgotten. In 1988, they dedicated To Live Is to Die on And Justice for All to him, using lyrics and music he had written. In 2009, Cliff was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with the band. Rolling Stone ranked him among the top 10 greatest bassists in rock history. Yet beyond numbers and rankings, Cliff is remembered as an artist who dared to live true, simple, proud, and uncompromising. Every time For Whom the Bell Tolls echoes across a stage, or when fans cover Orion on his birthday, people don't just hear bass, they hear the voice of a soul that proved metal could be filled with poetry, pain, and eternal beauty. That is Cliff Burton's legacy, not buried by time, but resonating through generations of musicians and listeners. Cliff Burton does not need statues of stone or loud proclamations to be immortal. His power lies in turning loss into creation, pain into music, leaving behind a flame still felt in millions of hearts today. Death ended a life, but it could not end the resonance of a soul that lived with complete devotion to art and honesty. And perhaps the real question is not, what would Metallica have been if Cliff had lived, but how could someone with such a brief presence leave such a profound mark? The answer remains. In every note, every memory, and in every generation of artists walking the path he opened. What about you? What did Cliff Burton leave behind for you? Is it the haunting bass lines of Orion, the image of a long-haired young man in flared jeans walking quietly, or the way he lived, unpretentious, genuine, and wholly dedicated to music? Share your thoughts below so Cliff's memory doesn't just remain in the past, but continues to echo in the present. And if you believe this story deserves to be heard by more people, support it with a like and subscribe, because sometimes the most beautiful tribute is keeping that flame alive in more hearts.